Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of Vertical Stars Podcast 4th season. My loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. It's an amazing episode because stand-up comedian Brian Kiley boards the mothership. Now come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Kiley. Thank you for coming to Vertical Stars Podcast.
Jeff, thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Like I said, thank you for coming to the show. You're a fantastic comic. So I
Well,
look
thank
forward
you.
to getting all the information about how to do stand-up from you. So as the
Okay.
expert. So I always start with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for stand-up and comedy, and who are your earliest influences?
You know what? As a kid, I always loved jokes. And I remember I got in trouble in the second grade where I took a joke book out of the library and I didn't return it. And they're like, "Hey, you have to bring it back." And I just wanted to keep it. Um, so even as a kid, I just loved jokes and I think, I think making my older brother laugh at an early age. You know, my older brother's 7 years older, and I think that joy of making him laugh just kind of took over my life. And I loved getting a good laugh at school, and even to the point where I remember when I was a kid, and there was, we had Mike Douglas and Merv Griffin had these afternoon talk shows. Once in a while there'd be a stand-up on and I'd be outside playing or whatever, and my mother would go, "Brian, there's a comedian on," and I'd come in the house and I'd watch the comedian and then I'd go back out and play. So that was a big part. Then I loved the Dick Van Dyke Show. I wanted to be a comedian, but I didn't know how people became comedians. But when I saw the Dick Van Dyke Show, I realized it's like, oh, all these sitcoms that I'm watching have writers. So I knew that it was possible to have a career in comedy. So even I would probably say probably around age 12, when I realized I wasn't going to make it to the Red Sox or make it to the NFL, that I was like, you know what? I think this comedy thing might be what I'd like to do.
I feel like we all come to that realization one day that we're not going to play baseball as professionally. I realized, I think maybe 9 or 10, that I probably wasn't going to be playing for the Orioles anytime soon.
Yes, it is an interesting because you still wanted to have that dream,
Yeah.
but at some point you go, uh-oh.
Well, I'm assuming there's a loop in my brain when I go watch a baseball game. I think to myself, you know what? Maybe they can call me in right now. One day they'll be like, "Oh, yeah, Jeff, get to come to the plate." I get that one at
Yes,
bat.
yes.
But
Well,
there's
my
a
son got pretty far. My son ended up playing professional ball. He played independent ball, which I guess they said was the equivalent of A ball. So his league was owned by Major League Baseball, but it wasn't affiliated with a team. But he pitched for Alan Embry, who was the manager for his team in Oregon, and then a guy named Jim Riggleman, who managed five major league teams, was his last manager in Billings, Montana.
what position was he?
He was a pitcher, and
Very cool.
he threw about 93, which when I was a kid, that made you could go to the majors, and now it's like not fast enough. So
Well, yeah, I mean, well, but that's also why they blew out their arms with Tommy
yes,
John
yes,
surgery after about 6 months because they're throwing
that's
99,
true.
100.
That's true. But
But
when we were kids, Nolan Ryan threw 100 and nobody else,
yeah.
And now these guys you never heard of coming in and throwing 100, and you go, "Who's this guy?" So
But like I said, as someone who loves baseball, like I said, and watching the progression of pitching, like especially with speed, I do think that's why they're blowing out their arms
yes,
in a year
yes.
or two because that's not their throwing motion is not natural. They're getting 100, but they're not doing it in a natural motion whatsoever.
No, and also when we were kids, there'd be several guys who get 20 wins every year.
Yep.
Now, if one guy gets it, then he doesn't the next year, and that's it. You know what I mean? Like it's very hard to have that consistency.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but did you get to watch his games? Did you get to go to his games and
I
watch him
did. I
play?
did. I got to go to a lot of his games and other ones I could watch online, but I would be so nervous when I was there. I always watched from far away, you know.
You know, one thing I always wonder about, and as it's probably something to being a comedian, is like, can you tell by looking, going watching, who are the ones who are going to go professional and who are the ones who are just kind of like your amateurs? Because, like I said, in baseball, I don't think I could tell just by look. I mean, you could tell by the stats, but like just looking at a player, be like, that's the guy who's going to be, your 300 hitter, 40 home run guy, or your 3 ERA guy. And same with comedy, like, can you just tell that this guy has it?
That is a good question. I hosted an open mic for years in Cambridge, and sometimes somebody would come in on their first time ever on stage, and they were pretty good. And I would be like, "Hey, this, whatever." And then some of them didn't get any better, and then somebody would come in and they wouldn't be that great, and then they'd be a little better the next week, and then the next week, and then they got to be good. So I find it very hard to predict.
When you think about comedy, is it an innate skill that they're improving upon? Is there a way that you can go like comedy school and like learn the craft of it, or is that just a natural thing?
Well, I mean, I do think you can take a class with a good teacher, and I think that you'll get some good tips or whatever. But I kind of equate it to golf, even though I don't play golf anymore. But I do think, if you're a great athlete and you do it comedy once and you play golf once a month, you're not going to be great at it. But if you're a pretty good athlete and you play golf every day, you probably will get good at it,
Hmm.
So I do think it has to do, some people have a natural charisma and they're naturally funny, but they don't have that fire in the belly of they've got to be on stage and they've got to do it. And so I do think, my friend Laurie Kilmartin always says, do it every night for 10 years and you'll be good at it. And for the most part, that's true. Some people, it could take 200 years and they still won't be good at it. But for the most part, if you've got potential and you do it every night for 10 years, you'll be good at it. And most people just don't want to hear that because they want to be famous immediately and all that kind of stuff.
Now, when you're trying to get better at comedy, okay?
Mhm.
Once again, I've never been a stand-up for many reasons, but for those who do, and like that, even though I've never done stand-up or I'd always been fascinated by the craft of it.
Sure.
Is it a question of timing? Is it a question of the technique of the turn? Like once you do the joke and then doing that turn, what is it that you actually are getting better at?
Well, it depends on the person. Some people are natural performers, but their material isn't very good, so they really have to learn how to develop material. Some people actually, they're good, they come up and they have actually good material or potentially good material, but they have terrible stage presence and whatever. So usually it just takes a time, whatever your weakness is, it just takes time to overcome your weakness and develop your strength or whatever. So it's kind of a person to person thing. But um and also I think you have to, I think you can't be stubborn. And if something's not working, you have to fix it, you have to make adjustments, and you're kind of making adjustments all the time because your act is always a work in progress. And I think, sometimes when I go play, I'll see a comedian who they kind of locked in their act in the 80s and it would kill then. And then they've never changed it. And it's like, well, society changes and things, references get old, and things that used to be okay to say aren't anymore. And so you have to constantly, I saw this older comic recently doing this bit about ugly people. And I know that it used to kill for him, but it's kind of like as a society now, we're kind of like, yeah, we're not really into that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you can't just build your act and think it's set in stone and that's how it's going to be because the world changes and you have to kind of adapt.
Like one stand-up I was watching recently, I mean, it's an old routine that he had because it was on television, but it's a good one. Mark Maron, who
Uh-huh.
is it's such he's such a good comic, and he made a reference to how some comics will talk about they can't do certain jokes anymore, and or certain because of political correctness, something of that nature, or that do you feel that that actually is a thing in comedy, or do you think comics like at all times just adapt to whatever considered then appropriate or whatever?
Well, I do think, yeah, I mean, I do think jokes that used to be okay, even when I started, um, and and before I started, like in the 70s, there was a ton of ethnic jokes, and prior to that, and there was some of that when I started in the 80s, but um, as a society, we've kind of moving away from that, and also where people used to be. It's more like you're Irish, you grew up in an Irish neighborhood. You're Italian, you grew up in an Italian neighborhood. Blah, blah, Jewish, you got whatever. And now more people are, well, they're half Italian and they're half Irish and they're quarter this and so I think people have less of an ethnic identity
Hmm.
and they're more see themselves just themselves as Americans. And also, I think those stereotypes, uh, people realize can be negative and so on. So, yeah, I do think you have to adapt and but I think, I worked not too long ago with Tom Dreesen, he's got to be in his 80s, and he used to open for Sinatra, and he's a pretty famous comic, and he had new material that was fresh and it was funny, and I was so impressed that this guy in his 80s is still writing and still putting out stuff that's funny and relevant, and I was like, wow, good for him.
Well, like I'll say with you're famous for your one-liners because you do these great you do these great one-liners, and there's different kind of comedians. There's, the ones like the one-liners. There's one that do kind of like a story narrative that's humor,
Yes.
observational humor, all this different types of comedy. How did you determine where your niche was going to be?
Well, that's a great question because, as a kid, uh, I was probably about when I was about 13, I realized it's like, hey, I want to be a comedian. I better write some jokes and because I'm going to need them. So I would write jokes from time to time, or if I said something funny in conversation that I think, oh, that's a funny joke, I would write it down. I had these note cards, and I would put my jokes down, and I kept them on my desk. I was such a comedy nerd. I kept them on my desk. My mother gave me like one of her like little recipe boxes, and I would keep my jokes in there. And I don't know whatever happened to those jokes. I'm sure they were terrible, but you kind of have to start somewhere. So, um, as a kid, I would just write jokes. When I started doing stand up, I was all over the place. Like, I didn't, I try to tell a story, or I try to do like a bit, or I tried to do impressions. I was a terrible impressionist. And pretty early on, I realized, okay, I'm a joke writer, like in the sort of in the vein of a Rodney Dangerfield, and that's what I'm gonna do. You know, I don't know that you get to choose your style necessarily. I do feel like, to use a baseball analogy again, it's like I feel like Phil Necro, where it's like, okay, I've got this knuckleball, and people will say, why don't you throw it 100 miles an hour like that guy? Well, there are people that are great storytellers that I wish I could tell a 5-minute story like that, or I wish I could do impressions like so and so or whatever. So you just have to go with what you're actually naturally good at and just kind of hone that.
Now, how much time do you spend in a day writing jokes? And are you someone who literally sits down and intentionally writes a joke, or do the jokes kind of come to you throughout the day and you just write them down as they pop?
I do sit and write jokes every day, and I try to do it first thing in the morning because when I was young, I would write late at night. And the same thing even when I was in college, I would stay up late and write papers and blah, blah, blah. Now that I'm old, I have to write first thing in the morning when my brain is fresh. And it's what Conan says when you have your good goo. And so when my brain is fresh, even before breakfast, I like to sit and what I try to do every day is is write 5 jokes first thing in the morning. And that said, the day before, maybe I said something at dinner that I thought, oh, that's funny, and jot it down. Or sometimes I'll just see an area where I go, I don't know what the joke is yet, but that is a good area to think about, you know? So when I start in the morning, I usually have one or two, either a joke from the day before that I've kind of already got in the chamber, or an area that I want to explore. So I'm not starting with nothing usually. Occasionally I am, but usually I have one or two things percolating so that when I sit down, I can kind of jumpstart it and get it going.
So, and when you're writing, is it the setup that comes first and then the turn, or is it the turn that comes first and then you kind of figure out how to kind of like get there?
Um, it depends on the joke. So there are times when I figure out the punchline and I have to kind of go back and uh, figure out the setup. Um, but then there are times where I'm just kind of playing with the setup and turning it this way and that way until I go, oh, I get the joke. It's this, you know. So yeah, either way.
And I think part that's kind of fascinating is that once you write these jokes, and you probably write, I assume you're writing way more jokes than you're presenting.
Yeah,
Um, where like when is it like you kind of feel like you can take that leap of faith with a joke that you're ready to go into public? Because for me, anything that would always stop me from being a stand-up would be the terror of standing in front of a bunch of people and realizing all my jokes suck, and then it's just that dead cricket silent in front of me, which to me would be horrifying. But as a comedian, you're gonna have to have some of those jokes as well because you're not gonna hit like a baseball player. You're not gonna hit your batting average can't be 1,000. No one's batting average
right,
is 1,000.
right, right.
Even the
Well,
greats.
absolutely. Well, it is. You do have to be willing to fail in order to get better. And I do think, as I say, there are certain comics that I'll see who haven't written a new joke in 20 years because they don't want to fail. They don't want to have that moment. And to me, it's like, and it's funny because Steve Wright used to talk to me about it. I was lucky starting out in Boston, and I got to work with these great comics and get their advice. And one of the things he would say to me is, you have to suck in order to get good. And there is that thing of, as you say, I'll write a bunch of things. Some of them I think, well, that's a good tweet, but it's not a good joke on stage or whatever. And then some when I go back, I think, that's too obscure or that's not strong enough or whatever the problem is. But then the ones that I like, which it's probably it's probably less than 10% that I think, well, this is worth trying on stage. Um, and I don't like a lot of witnesses when I'm failing. So some comics are different, and I know Woody Allen used to say the best time to try out a joke was on a packed show on a Saturday night at 8 o'clock or whatever. I don't, unless I'm really have a good feeling about it, and I've been burned even by then. I'd rather try out a joke on a Tuesday night in front of 20 people, in a spread out crowd, where I'm slipping it in the middle, and if a few couple, where it's not a lot of pressure, and if a joke doesn't work, it's not that big a deal. I don't like when the laughs go from here to here. If it's a small crowd and whatever, and they're only this high anyway, then the fall isn't so great.
Well, one thing I think it must be, or maybe I'm wrong, but let me know. A benefit to doing your one-liner is that it feels like they're almost like machine gun fire. Like you try one, it does, you immediately go to the next one. I wonder, like these comics who like do these long stories, and when they bomb, it's like you spent a 5-minute build for that
Yes.
dead
Yeah.
silence.
Yeah.
Is there a benefit to doing the rapid fire jokes that you have?
Yes. I mean, there are strengths there. That is one of the benefits of if it's something tanks, you've only wasted 15 seconds of theirs. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? You've got a 10-minute story and it bombs. You've gone out on a long limb. The disadvantage and the other advantage of doing the short jokes, it was great for doing late night sets where you're doing 5 minutes and you can go out and do 18 punchlines in 5 minutes, as opposed to telling a 5-minute story or whatever. The disadvantage is if you have to do 45 minutes or an hour, an hour of 15-second jokes. that's a ton of jokes. And also it it's it's asking a lot of the audience too. They get tired out. It's like I don't it's hard for a crowd to laugh 4 times a minute for an hour. Do you know what I mean? Whereas if you're telling a story, it's a slower pace, but it's more palatable over the course of a long time.
When you're developing your jokes, because once again, you're as someone who's you're very well known as the one-liner. Do you like? Is there Are you able to maneuver to doing like stories when you feel like it, or when you're set in a style and there's an expectation of you? Do you must you live within the expectation?
Yeah, I mean, I do think you people have a certain expectation from me, and even um, I can tell a joke that's a little risque or whatever, but if I tell an actual dirty joke, the, sometimes the crowd, but other comedians will be really mad at me. And sometimes the crowd's mad. Even it's like, there are times where I follow the filthiest guy in the world and he kills, and then I say something slightly, and the crowd's like, hey, hey, come on now. And it's like, what? That guy said the filthiest thing I ever heard, and you loved it. So I think there is a little bit of they built an expectation from me. Um, and a couple of times I'll tell a true story on stage that's an actual story and whatever. Um, and I would love to be able to do that just to kind of shift gears. I just don't know how to do it, you know.
I think one of the things that's fascinating with you is that once again, you're a hilarious comic, but
Well,
and you're a clean comic. And there's some comics who are like, well, you can't tell this type of, but you prove that you can because you're a clean comic for the most part. Was that a choice to be a clean comic, or is that just your naturally just that type of individual?
well, it was an actual choice. I think when I started out, I did have some dirty jokes when I first started, and then I think I realized that I really wanted to be on Johnny Carson. So I kind of set that as a goal and I really worked towards that. And sometimes I was in bars where they didn't want to hear a clean act. And even sometimes that still comes to. I don't like when quote unquote clean comics have this moral, they try to take the moral high ground because it's like, come on, I saw a young comic recently who was squeaky clean. And I just thought his jokes were so gentle. It just, to me, I even though I try to write clean, I still want my jokes to be hard hitting and have a strong punchline. So, and then there are dirty comics that I do think there are some dirty comics that are hilarious, and there's some dirty comics that just get laughs because they're dirty, you
Yeah.
know? And then there's some clean comics that don't do it for me, and then there's some clean comics that I think are hilarious. So I think there's no rule in that. I just don't like when someone acts that they're morally superior because, oh, I work clean or whatever. That always nauseates me.
Well, I think some of your jokes that are some of the funniest ones I've heard of yours. I'm not gonna do the joke because I can't deliver the way you did. But I'll mention the joke, and everyone can assume that when you do it, it's funnier than when I'm gonna say it. There's the one where you do with Hitler, and the one that you
Yes.
couldn't choke Hitler as a baby, but as a teenager, you
Yeah.
totally could. And as someone who is a teacher of junior high, I think myself, I totally get where you're coming from. That's a hilarious joke. And when you're thinking about that, once again, you have that moment where you're bringing up Hitler, like, uh-oh, you can tell, there's that question. When do you know that's a joke you can do in a particular audience, or is there or are you able to like stand up and go, this audience is probably good for these jokes or not these jokes, or do you have a set you're definitely going to go through your set?
Yes, I definitely. So my Hitler joke, I had this joke about, you do hear that sometimes of if you had a time machine, would you go back and kill baby Hitler? And I'm a dad. I couldn't kill a baby, but I could strangle teenage Hitler. And I have gotten some blowback from that joke from time to time. I think older crowds, when they hear Hitler, are like, whoa, do you know what I mean? I think younger crowds are kind of like they're a little more amenable to a Hitler joke and whatever. So, um, I think an edgier crowd I'll do that joke for. If I have a crowd of senior citizens, I won't or whatever. So, and if I'm doing a show at a synagogue or something, it's like I'm not going to bring up Hitler, you know what I mean? But like when I was in Israel, I did 6 shows in Israel in January last year. I didn't mention Hitler, you know. Um, but if I'm doing a bar show and it's a younger audience or whatever, yeah, I'll do a Hitler joke.
Like that, I mean, the joke. I just think that joke was just genius because once again, there's this that the twist obviously too, and you there's layers to understanding the joke. Like as a father, you do want to strangle your teenager. I like that as a teacher of middle school. I
Sure.
can definitely think in my head.
I
I can
can only
definitely
imagine.
want to strangle a teenager, and I think it's genius. And so when the other thing that's fascinating too is like, let's say when you're trying your new jokes, right?
Hmm?
Do you know if when and when 'cause, like you said, jokes are gonna fail from time to time. Do you know the joke failed because it's the joke or is it because of the audience sometimes? Like, can you tell the
Well,
difference?
that's also a very good question. You know, there are times where you try a new joke the first time and it kills, and you think, "Oh, I've got this new thing," and then it never works again, and you're like, what happened?" Um, I'm sure there are jokes that I tried once and it failed, and I never did it again. That it was just a bad audience, and that joke would have worked if I had tried it with a different crowd or whatever. But I also sometimes that I feel injured when a joke gets nothing. So uh, it's some people are like, oh, you got to try it 3 times or whatever. It's like it depends on the joke. So many times I'm guilty of trying a joke once, and if it doesn't work, never trying it again. Um, but I do think sometimes it's the crowd, and sometimes I know years ago I had this joke about. I went to therapy today, and halfway through my session, my therapist said to me, "Oh, by the way, this is a podcast." And what I found was an older crowd isn't listening to podcasts, or they weren't 10 years ago or whatever. So that was a joke that I was like, "Oh, I thought this was a surefire joke because the other crowds it went great." So sometimes it's just a reference, and sometimes it works the other way, where I have an older crowd and they're getting the reference that I'm making, and a younger crowd isn't. So yes, I mean sometimes yeah, absolutely. I do think age is to me is the biggest factor. I love doing all black shows. I love doing synagogue shows. I love doing I, I think um I think age is the biggest factor in terms of I mean I love it when I have a young crowd and it goes well, but I think sometimes they're just not relating to me as much, you know.
Well, like I said, but another one of your jokes that you did, once again, I'm trying to do, I'm going to try to explain the jokes without, you made a reference that, I'm trying to remember how it goes exactly, but basically, since you've been married, your wife has given you, you only had 2 minutes of material before you got married. Now you have all this material, and I thought, once again, it was hilarious for multiple reasons. Once again, someone who's married, I get it, but at the same time, um, is some truth to that? That now that you have a family and all that, are you finding that it's easier to develop it? I mean, does your family just interacting with them just kind of make these things happen?
Yes, yes. And I do think I did a show for 200 lunch ladies last year. And it was 200 women, they're all lunch ladies and me. And I was doing okay. And then I went to my marriage material, and that's what won them over. And it made me feel good because they weren't looking at, oh, here's a husband being mean about his wife. They were, I mean, I try to make it where I'm the butt of the joke.
Yeah.
And the fact that all these women liked my marriage material really made me feel good, you know? So, yeah, I do think you want them you want them relating to you. You want things to strike a chord with them too, you know?
Like, do you find that your family, whatever so often, is like, oh my God, you're gonna make a joke out of this, aren't you? I mean, do they know like you're always kind of listening? Or
Well, here's the thing. Well, like I wouldn't. like all my stuff are jokes. So, I do hear comics sometimes and they're telling these personal stories about their spouse or whatever. And sometimes they're so personal and you can tell they're true that I'm uncomfortable, you know? So I have a joke about I met my wife on jury duty, and thanks to me, she was acquitted. She's not actually a felon. Do you know what I mean? So, and I don't think people will leave and go, oh, his wife's a criminal, you know? So, if there was something that if she was touchy about or something, and that's a real thing that I was, if her dad had been in prison, say, and I was making jokes about it, I think that she might be like, hey, this is, but, um, I think everyone knows that it's a joke and so it, so and yeah, so I try not to say, I do a joke about my daughter. We found out that my wife told me that daughter's been shoplifting, so now I have to deal with that, and I'm gonna wait until after my birthday. If you were an actual shoplifter, that, I don't think I would do those jokes.
Well, like some of your one-liners that are, I mean, there's something that is sort of relatable. There's one I can't remember exactly how you get to the punchline, but it's the one about paying for the student loans, and you kind of like which like, you're trying to figure out like how like why you're paying these the college loans. That's what like once again going to school. I mean, they're so relatable that they feel there's a realness to them, and it
Well, I think that to me, that what I try to stress, because sometimes I'll have young comics or people that talk, the premise has to be believable. And because otherwise, there was a comic I used to work with years ago who was just this emaciated guy, and he did this bit about buying condoms, and the whole crowd is thinking, what does this guy need a condom for?
yeah.
And when he changed the bit and said, I had to buy some condoms because my other ones expired, then the crowd was like, you know what, we're on board now. So there's a there has to be a believability, and there are times when I see a male comic talk about, oh, I'm dating this model and blah blah blah, and you're like, no, you're not. And we're not on board. So to me, you have to buy into the premise, otherwise it's not going to work.
Well, I think that's very cool. And we mentioned a little bit off air, but that you've been a writer for Conan O'Brien for decades, just about decades.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
Is it different writing for somebody? Because funny thing is, like when if you fail a joke, you fail. But now you're writing somebody else's joke who could then fail. I mean, is that change the arithmetic in your joke?
yes. I mean, so I wrote for Conan on the show for 27 years. And, you know, I was writing working on his monologue every day. And I think, so all those jokes they're all tried for the first time. So there is that thing of, because as a stand-up, you can try a joke and it doesn't work. And then you go, oh, you know what? I need to adjust it and say it like this. Or you can tweak it. And by the third or fourth time you tell it, then it does work. We don't have that chance. It's just one shot and that's it. But you have other people weighing in, and you have Conan weighing in, which helps. If I'd say it like this instead of that, or a million times he tweaked my jokes. Um, but yes, I mean, you know, one time we would get a bad crowd when there'd be a certain band, like a band would come on, and all their fans would get all the tickets somehow. I don't know how they did it, but they'd go on the website and they'd get all the tickets. And depending on the band, especially early on in the show, they did not care about our comedy or our guests. They only wanted the band. So the first 40 minutes of the show would be terrible because they're just waiting for the band to come out. But I do remember one time the monologue didn't go well. And Conan comes to my office the next day and he's like, how do you feel when you send me
Right.
out there with that shit? And there's a scene. Did you ever see the movie Rear Window with
Yes.
Jimmy Stewart? So there's a scene, Jimmy Stewart's got two broken legs, and he's looks out his window of his apartment, and he thinks he witnesses a murder. So when Raymond Burr, the bad guy, leaves, he sends his girlfriend Grace Kelly in to investigate. And while she's in there, Raymond Burr comes home early and he starts manhandling her. And Jimmy Stewart is watching through his binoculars with two broken legs helplessly while she's being bandied about. And I said, that's how I feel when I'm watching the monologue go down in flames, just helplessly. There's nothing I can do.
Was he kidding or was he?
He was kind of half kidding, like I mean, he was, he wasn't happy, but, you know, we did 4,000 shows. Sometimes you can have a bad show. Sometimes you can have a bad crowd, which was it? I don't know. But that's going to happen sometimes. The one saving grace was they could take out a joke if it didn't work. So, and then other times a joke wouldn't work, but then Conan would be funny making fun of how the joke didn't work. So then we would keep that in.
Hmm.
So you did have a little bit of, and it didn't happen early on for whatever reason, but then we were able to edit out a joke that had bombed sometimes, or sometimes we'd have a joke that we felt bad about in terms of it's like, we shouldn't say that or whatever. And so we would have sometimes we'd have a pang of conscience and take it out too.
I mean, that's also and when you're writing because once again you have your own style, but you're writing
Mhm.
for Conan. Does it? Are you writing differently because you're trying to write in somebody else's? And is it hard to write in somebody else's humor voice or vernacular?
Well, it depends on the person. I was fortunate with Conan in that, you know, I would write about 40 or 50 jokes a day for him. So, but of those 200 or 250 jokes in a week, there'd maybe be one joke that I loved, that I just loved this one. And he would pick that joke, which he would pick that joke. So that always made me feel good that we were simpatico in that. Um, so I was fortunate in that, he and I had a lot in common. We were two repressed Irish Catholic guys from big families in suburban Boston. So we had some similar backgrounds, so that helped in terms of getting his voice. I will say this though, when I started, I, I like a good wordplay joke, and he didn't like wordplay jokes. And I had a joke early on where there was a woman who gave birth on the New York City subway, and they wrapped the baby in the Sunday New York Times. And my joke was, coincidentally, it was the C-section. And I thought it was a clean, funny joke and whatever. Hated it, it's corny, crossed it out, whatever. And I realized early on, it's like, oh, he doesn't like any wordplay jokes or whatever. So he kind of beat those out of me. And I even stopped writing them for my act just because I kind of, I- you know, I had to learn that that was not okay. So.
Is it different? Because once again, you not only have you written for Conan for 20 something years, but you've been with him in different iterations of Conan, from the late night with Conan O'Brien to Tonight Show, and then I think you also wrote from the show they did after that. I can't remember the name of that one.
Oh, just called
Um,
Conan. Yeah.
are the jokes different depending if you were with the late night show or the Tonight Show? I mean, does that change the joke or the type of jokes you wanted to give him?
Um, that's an interesting question. I don't know how the jokes evolved. I guess with the Tonight Show, we had an older crowd, so they were probably a little bit right down the middle, where I think with the late night show and even the TBS show, we could be a little sillier or have some jokes that are a little more out there. Um, but so yeah, I would say there was slightly different, but yeah.
Were there ever jokes that you wrote that you were so proud of or were so good that you kept for yourself instead of giving to him for your own cinema? You were like, that one's mine.
No, because people do ask me that. When I started, I used to do a lot of, way back then, I used to do a lot of topical jokes in my act. So I I realized I said, I'm just going to give him, I'm not going to do any more topical stuff in my act. I'm just going to give him all the topical stuff and keep all the personal stuff from me. So, um, anything that happened in the news, whether it's about Michael Jackson or Bill Clinton or whoever, I just gave him all those. I didn't want to have that little moral dilemma every day of like, oh, let me hold on to this one or whatever.
So those are the kind of interesting. Working with someone like Conan, who once again, with Conan, he actually wasn't a stand-up, if I remember correctly,
Mhm.
before he became a host. What
Yes.
did you learn from comedy from him, and what do you think he learned from comedy from you?
Well, that those are great questions. What I learned from him was, first of all, like he's has such a unique mind, and also he you could tell why he was a graduated whatever summa cum laude from Harvard, and whatever he did, he he would prepare and prepare and prepare. And if like if Conan had to give the commencement speech at Dartmouth or something like that, he would work on it, and rewrite it and rewrite it. And I think the rest of us, I know I have a tendency to be like, it's good enough. It'll be good. You know what I mean? And he doesn't have that. He's like, nope, it's not good enough and whatever. And I think that his um, perfectionist tendencies rubbed off on me, where a lot of times I'm writing stuff now, I'm like, no, this isn't good enough. This joke isn't good enough to try on stage or whatever. I really he's made me raise the bar. And the only thing that I influenced him, I would say, in the old days, so sometimes you have a joke and then you have a tag after the joke, just like a little follow-up thing. And would be in the meeting and he would read through the jokes and he would have a hilarious tag and then he wouldn't go out there and do it. And one day I said to him, I said, you're leaving money on the table here. You can't, if you've got a funny joke and then you have a funny follow-up, you've got to do the tag. So um, he started doing those and sometimes he even built on that and so I was glad that I was able to put my 2 cents in there.
Now, I also read somewhere that you're in a documentary called "The Funny Thing About Death." Is that true? I read that on an ID and B page that you are in an upcoming film called that.
Yes. So my friend Lisa Alvarado, who's a very funny comic in LA, she she was performing and she met a guy who he had some terminal disease or whatever, and she was his favorite comic, and they became friends. And he was he was going to die, and he actually had a he was going to do that. It was a euthanasia thing where he was going to there's some program where he was going to take his own life at a certain point. So a an expiration date, for lack of a better term. So he wanted to try stand up before he died. So she hired a she asked a bunch of us to get together and come up with some jokes for him and brainstorm and whatever. So 5 or 6 of us got together. I think we were in groups of 3 or something, and we would write jokes for him but we did it. It was so interesting because we hadn't met him. She just told us this. We go over to her place. We're all riffing on these jokes and adding stuff in and whatever, and we're laughing and coming up with stuff. And then the guy shows up, and we meet him, and I mean that was pretty intense. Where it's like, oh, this dude he's dying on this date. It was, a month from now or whatever. 2 weeks from now, he's going to do his show and whatever. And, it's quite eerie meeting someone knowing, okay, a month from now, they're not going to be around. And that kind of changed the whole thing for us where, it's like, oh, he's going to do these jokes one time and then 2 weeks later he's going to die. So that was quite I don't even it just was kind of mind blowing for me. I don't even know how to describe
So
it.
I mean, the interesting I thought because I thought about the documentary and that kind of stuck with me the concept of it,
Mhm.
the idea of comedy and stand-up being something more than just entertainment. Now, when you think about your stand-up, do you think it as just simply entertainment, or do you think there's like a greater purpose of comedy?
Um, Usually I think of it as just entertainment, which is not a small thing. I mean, I think that we've all, how many times have you been depressed or something and you see a funny movie or you laugh with your friends and you whatever and you feel better and I mean that happens to us every day, you know. So I mean that's I don't want to minimize that. But I think in some shows it's just a show. People came to the show and they hopefully it went well or whatever. But I have, I used to, there was a woman named Sally Elcordy who she would book these shows in New York where we'd be at a VA hospital or at a homeless shelter or at they had these shows at Sloan Kettering for cancer patients. And I remember sometimes, I'd have a bad day at Conan or whatever, and I'd show up there, and as soon as you show up, you're like, whoa, okay, my problems are minuscule. And there were times when I would do shows and there are six cancer patients, or I did one show where it was the mom had cancer and the two teenage daughters were there with the husband, and it was just a show for four people, and they laughed at everything, and it was heartbreaking to see this. But you felt like, hey, these people really did need a laugh, and this was more than just a regular show. So I think sometimes it can actually mean more than you realize.
So one of like I said, one of your acts that I got to watch is you on the from Dry Bar, I guess is on YouTube, and
Mhm.
your specials. When do you determine when you're ready to do your next special? Do you have one plan coming up?
Well, that's kind of, that thing we talk about having those short jokes. It's harder to build time. So, I did a dry bar special, and for those who don't know, it's done in Utah at a bar that there's no alcohol, and your set has to be completely clean. So I always work TV clean, but on TV you can say the word sex, you can say, you can get away with some things or whatever. This is like doing a church show. So. Um, I had to do 25 minutes of squeaky clean. I'd love to do another one. I don't think I have 25 minutes of squeaky clean yet, but it's going to take me a year or two, but I'd love to do another one at some point. Yeah.
So what's next for you?
Well, Conan is hosting the Oscars, so I'm writing for that. So
Oh,
that's
very cool.
yeah, so that's exciting. I've never been to the Oscars, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, that's awesome. Anytime you want to come back to the show and talk about any specials or doing the jokes for the Oscars, please come back on this show. You're absolutely
Yeah, sure.
fantastic. Thank you so much.
I had a great time. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Have a very good night.
You too.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Further Stars podcast. Please like and subscribe. Return for the next episode when Tim Fellingham boards the mothership to discuss Wyatt Earp and the Cowboy War on Netflix. To next voyage, travel on.